I'm going to start with Courtney Cogburn. She's a PhD. She's assistant professor of social work at Columbia School of Social Work. Her research includes, looks at the relationships between racism-related stress and racial health disparities across the life course. She's also been supported by the National Institutes of Health and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And recently, she completed a study of media racism and media activism in the context of recent events surrounding police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement, including, that means Baltimore, even though it's new, Ferguson, all these communities around the country that's been amazed with that. She's also the co-author of numerous publications, including Race and Gender, Discrimination and Identity Among African American Adolescents. And also her academic research includes working with the Southern Jamaica Plain Health Center at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and she's a senior advisor at the International Center Advocates Against Discrimination in New York City. Please welcome her to our panel. And I met Abigail Forrester today. His life serves as an extraordinary testament to hope and possibility. He was incarcerated at the age of 21, served a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence for a first offense. He found guidance and direction through self-reflection and mentorship by positive role models while he was incarcerated. He also attributes two essential factors to his transformation, that is spirituality and trauma recovery. Since completing his sentence, he's also used his life to pay it forward and mentor other young, especially court-involved youth. And he also has a bachelor's degree in psychology from UMass Boston. He worked for Strive, Boston Employment Service, where he supported the organization while developing its first criminal offender job readiness curriculum, infusing both psychodynamic and behavioral therapy exercises as part of Strive's job readiness training. And he also worked for the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, the Boston Foundation Street Safe Boston Initiative, Youth Build USA, and is currently working for Madison Park Development Corporation as the Director of Community Action. Please welcome Adjabel. And finally, a woman who needs no introduction. She's done an incredible job. I'm going to read a little bit from her bio, but you know her because of her amazing success in Massachusetts and the work that she's done. She has had a career of history-making campaigns and a relentless determination to advance a political agenda focused on women and girls and breaking cycles of poverty and violence. Ms. Presley, Councilor Presley, was first elected to the Boston City Council in 2009, and becoming the first woman of color ever elected to the Boston City Council. That deserves applause itself, right? She was reelected in 2011 and 2013, and she made history as the first person of color and the first woman in 30 years to top the ticket. And during her time in office, she's created and chairs the City Council's Committee on Healthy Women, Families, and Communities. And the committee is devoted to the causes that she has always been most motivated to do: stabilizing families and communities, reducing and preventing violence and trauma, combating poverty, and addressing issues that disproportionately impact women and girls. We can't think of a more dedicated person to the work that we do and that's important than the work done by Ayanna Pressley. Please thank Ayanna Pressley and the other panelists as well. I'm supposed to sit down, but everything's right here, so I'm going to stand up, if you don't mind. I wanted to take a few questions, and we've got a time constraint we're going to work with as well. I want to try to make sure that folks can answer these questions, and I'm going to ask the question, and anyone can pick it up, and other people want to respond to it as well. And then we're going to have a time for some Q&A from the audience. And I've been told that the yellow sign means we have 5 minutes left, and the red sign means, it says done, but means we have 2 minutes left, right? It means wrap up, right? So when those signs come up, I may miss them, but I'm told that she's going to walk up here and make sure, Ogletree, sit down, right? Okay, I'll be ready for that, okay? So, the first question is one that everyone understands. What brings you to the work that you do? Who wants to start with that?
So what brings me to the work that I'm focused on today is, this wasn't supposed to happen. I want to start out by saying that. And the reason why I say that is because if you heard in the bio that talked about, from the age of 21 to 31, I was one of the first young people in the state that received a 10-year mandatory sentence for drug trafficking. And the reason why I received that extended time is because I wouldn't become a government informant. And so in the journey of becoming incarcerated and hearing the narratives about what happens during and after incarceration, this wasn't supposed to happen. But I never forget the day that I sat up in Walpole. It was a winter day in November, and the windows were broken out, snow was coming in, and I blacked out in a sense of the space that I was in, because everything is relative, and I want to go back to something that Dr. Hardy talked about the psychological homelessness. I was asking myself, how does this young man who was an A student from first grade to fifth grade, pretty much sixth grade, an A student, honor roll all the time, ranked in tennis at the age of 7, how did he end up here? And I really had to sit up and ask myself, how did I end up here? And in asking myself that for about 2 days in that space, what came to me was the emotional abandonment that started when my father left my home. And I started to realize, and then I started to look at the compounded trauma that I faced throughout my life in the environment that I was growing up in, and the things that Dr. Hardy talked about in the sense of the psychological abandonment that I felt that created this young man that was so positive, that was so hopeful, that turned him into this hardened sort of being that didn't have any hope anymore, not only because of what I saw, but because of what my friends were feeling. And so that's why I start out by saying that this wasn't supposed to happen, because once I became incarcerated and I understood in that self-reflection what happened to me, and I started to say, well, let me do some research and start talking to other men about their experiences. And I started hearing about the psychological abuse. I started hearing about the abuse in foster care. I started hearing men talk about how they was raped as young boys. And so instead of feeling sorry for me, when I started hearing those stories, I started to understand that most of the issues that we have with our men in this country that people don't talk about is the fact that we've experienced trauma and no one gives us the right to talk about it. So in that space is where my commitment to this work and my commitment to trauma recovery really became the most important part of, I feel, when it comes to transformation.
Thank you so much. Great. Courtney, what brings you and what brings you to the work that you do?
The work I focus on is really driven by Black people dying sooner and faster than everybody else. If you look at the 15 leading causes of death, we have an earlier onset, a faster progression, and earlier death as a result of those diseases. Even when we account for socioeconomic factors like education, income, quality of health insurance, access to health insurance, we still die faster. Black women with a college degree have higher rates of low birth weight than any other racial ethnic group in socioeconomic status in the country. So it's not just a matter of socioeconomic status, there's something else killing us. And what I'm interested in are those daily traumas, those day-to-day things that happen that take a toll on the body day after day, time after time. Observing it among other people, it's not just happening to us, but seeing it on television. It's part of why I focus on racism in the media. If we think about if that's a stressor, if that's something that can have an effect on our bodies that takes a toll over time, that's something that we're exposed to every day. The average adult accesses media at least 9 hours a day. And we're exposed to racism constantly through that mechanism, in addition to what we're experiencing face to face and what we're seeing around us. And so I'm interested in understanding what is stressing us out and how is it killing us and what do we do about it at various points in our lives. What do we do with children? How do we help our youth handle and deal with these types of issues? How do we deal with it as older adults? And how do we hold systems and structures accountable for the traumas that we experience on a day-to-day basis?
It's amazing when you think about either television, radio, or newspaper, you always see the headlines are about blacks dying. There's no question about that. And we have this almost sense of it doesn't affect us, which means that we're absorbing it, but it makes a big difference. Your sense, what have you been able to do at the Southern Jamaica Plain Health Center? I don't want you to mention any clients' names, but what kind of things are you trying to do to make sure that people are restoring themselves and being able to deal with all the things that they see on the radio, on the television, reading the newspaper, things like that?
So they do some really interesting work, and I'm basically helping them evaluate the effects of the programs that they already have in place. But they have some really interesting workshops around structural racism. How do we help people understand the very real structures and barriers that are in place in their communities, in society more broadly, and how that's having an impact on their lives and their health? And what they're seeing is that when people start to get educated about those types of issues, when we move away from this trifling narrative, you know, that you're not in shape, you have diabetes, you have high BMI, et cetera, because you're not eating what you're eating what you're not supposed to, you're not exercising, et cetera. That's certainly part of the story. But another part of the story is what we have access to in our communities. Another part of the story is where are you dumping trash? And it doesn't just happen to be in my neighborhood versus that neighborhood. And when people start to understand that narrative and not just the you're trifling narrative, they start to get mad. And they start to take better care of themselves, right? It's almost like they're taking care of themselves, you know, just to spite the people and forces that are against them. So they're showing some evidence that people who participate in this workshop are adhering to their health plans better, are seeing reductions in their dosage of medications, are getting off the medication altogether. So there's something important in my mind in the work with the Southern Jamaica Plain Health Center in particular in understanding this education about structural racism and how these forces are coming against us, not removing individual responsibility, but understanding the complexity of this big picture. If understanding that can actually benefit our health. And I was talking to Abigail as well about how civic engagement might also be beneficial for the health, right? So people who participate in this program are also more likely to go back into their communities, engage, and be civically engaged and activists in various ways.
Thank you very much. Councilor Pressley, let me ask you this. There's a lot of things you want to respond to, what kind of work you do every day, but I wanted to talk about one thing that really opened my eyes when we first started talking about it. We came to the City Hall, and I was talking to your colleague about My Brother's Keeper. And it didn't take you long to say, wait a minute, what about the girls? What about the women? What about the mothers? And what are the things that keep you awake, and what are the things that you're doing to try to make sure that we don't forget the women, the girls, the mothers, the grandmothers who are part of our society and the majority of our society as our focus for the 21st century? What do you think is the thing that we need to do, and what are you doing?
Yeah, well, you know, really, I hope the strength of advocacy that I've brought to the City Council and the lens is really just the need for us to have an equity in our outrage. You know, I get very uncomfortable about the fact that we start creating tiers of trauma and, you know, competing for whose dysfunction is greater. It really is not about my brother's keeper. It's not about my sister's keeper. It's about recognizing that our destiny is tied. Yeah. And I'm not interested in synchronized drowning. I'm interested in the collective and shared upliftment, advancement, and betterment of all of us. But in order for us to get there, we really need to have gender-specific and responsive programming across the board. Very often for our young boys and men, the metric for how they're doing will be defined according to the school-to-prison pipeline. So what is the metric for girls and women? Is it reported domestic violence? Is it sexual assault? Is it teen pregnancy? These are three of the most underreported things. And, you know, very often what happens, particularly within our school system, is that young boys will act out and young girls will shut down. So what I'm advocating for is an equity in our outrage and a commitment to the development of gender-specific and responsive programming across the board. You know, as I say all the time, and I see, you know, many of my allies in the work here, Mothers for Justice and Equality, Lipstick, the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute, Courtney Gray, so many people I've been working with for a long time. And, you know, when I ran for the council in 2009 for the first time, I got a lot of heat from black folks, you know, about the fact that I was talking about girls and women. And they said, you know, it's our boys that are dying on these streets. My advocacy for girls and women is not to the exclusion or even the detriment of our boys and men. Again, our destiny is tied, and I'm very concerned about the boys and men that are dying on our streets, but I'm just as concerned about the girls who are the walking dead, because they are a shadow of their former selves because of the physical and sexual trauma that they've experienced in our society. And the last thing I would say is broken girls grow up to be broken women, and they are usually raising these boys.
When you're on the Boston City Council, your hands are full because it's a board of people that are majority white. How do you get that through, get your message through to make sure that they understand race but understand gender as well?
Well, I have to say, I don't feel that my colleagues have been unresponsive or receptive to my advocacy and my platform advocating for those, for women and girls, or looking to break cycles of poverty, violence, and trauma. Really what was lacking on the council was just a lack of diversity. And so in government, we stand to benefit from the same thing we do in every other facet of society, and that's cognitive diversity. That's a diversity of perspective and opinion and thought. If you were working in a factory and everyone looked the same and was working on an assembly line, that works. You can be a monolith. You can be homogenized, and you might be successful and productive. But when you're talking about better understanding and informing what are the problems so that we can be customized and nuanced and specific in our approach, you need a diversity of perspective, opinion, and thought. So I have not felt that my colleagues have been unresponsive. We were derelict as a city in addressing these issues, but it wasn't malice, it was ignorance and a lack of perspective. But I do want to say this, I need your help. Because we as a community can not only hold accountable when it comes to addressing trauma, your black and brown elected officials. You need to be holding everyone accountable. And asking these questions of everyone. That is my biggest pet peeve. Every time there is a homicide, the media will call Counselor Jackson, who was here earlier, you need to know that. They'll call myself and Counselor Jackson and say, well, what are y'all gonna do? As if we're all not compromised by the violence that's occurring in our communities, domestic, sexual, street, and youth. So I think, the council has been receptive, but really that just comes from a greater diversity, and so we need to continue to push for greater gender and racial parity in government to bring that perspective.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to start with you, Councilor Presley, if that's okay. Ask this question. In the context of where you focus, how does trauma impact individuals, families, and the community, from your point of view?
You want to start with that?
I want to start with you, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I'll go the other way.
Oh, okay. How does it affect?
Yeah.
Well, it's destabilizing. It's generational. I know a lot of people were talking about their feeling that we're disconnected from our trauma. My experience is very different. I think we are really in the mud and the murk of it. It is true that a lot of times our drama and our dysfunction is something that is normalized, but I don't think we're not aware of our trauma. I think we're sitting in it. I think there isn't a commitment to treat it, and a lot of that has to do with a lack of tools. My mother was a survivor of incest, a survivor of domestic violence. I'm a survivor of a near decade of childhood sexual abuse and sexual assault as a young woman. And my mother could not help me because she never received the intervention, the supports that she needed, and didn't pursue them because of the shame and the stigma. So, we're aware of our trauma. We're just ashamed of it. Again, when I ran for council in 2009 and told my whole story, it was black folks that told me to stop telling the story because it made them uncomfortable, because it embarrassed them, because it perpetuated stereotypes. So, the bottom line is we have to be intentional about building community and about building healthy communities, and trauma gets in the way of that.
Well, it's amazing. I'm going to go now to Dr. Cogburn and also to Mr. Forrester. Talk about this in a broader context as well. How has it affected your relationships, Dr. Cogburn and Mr. Forrester, in the community? And have you had the same kind of relationships with people? Have you tried to do some things that make a big difference in the communities where you live?
I think an important component of trauma is accurately framing the levels of trauma, right? Some trauma is a building exploding, and some trauma you're just walking around with being hit slightly every day, right? And I think it's important to think about all those levels. I think some of my challenges have been that people get invested in their particular piece of it, and they think that that piece is more important than another piece. And I think it's important to better integrate across our efforts. People are working at multiple, this is a war, right? And we need to think strategically, and we can't just hit in one place, we have to hit in multiple places. And to do that, we have to listen to each other and respect each other's expertise. We all play different roles, and we need to learn to communicate across those lines better. But I think really an important component of that, all of it, and I think someone raised this earlier, that even as those who are working to help those who have been traumatized to acknowledge our own trauma and own our space in that as well. We can't really help others until we help ourselves.
Thank you. It's very interesting. We heard the presentation earlier, the conversation that, colleagues talk about, oh, you always write about race, as if it's just an occasional thing.
Yeah.
Has that been an issue that you've had to confront as a scholar, as a teacher?
It is, and I try to explain to people, I study race and racism very explicitly. I don't study ethnicity necessarily, I don't study culture necessarily. I study the way we've constructed race in this society and how that has become racism. And I don't apologize for that. And I try to make it clear to people that race and racism, I try to make it clear that race and racism underlie every facet of our society. I don't care what we're talking about, it's there. And so to me, it's relevant to everything, and I just try to do my best to communicate that and make it clear to people.
Thank you. Mr. Forrester, what's your sense about what we need to do to make sure that people understand, our friends, our family, our community understand the trauma that we're going through in a way that makes a difference?
Yeah, so one of the things I was thinking about, again, when Dr. Hardy was speaking, is how do we define the spaces of trauma, right?
Yep.
And so there's a space in which emotional trauma begins to deform character. And we don't give enough credence to that fact, right? And I think in other communities, they understand this clearly. So this is why you take a situation that happens in a place like Columbine, where a young person goes into a school, and they'll shut down the whole community, right? But you take a community like ours, where we're losing young men and young ladies every day, and we never shut down, right? And we just expect our kids to keep on rolling over their trauma, right? But the other part of it is that we need to understand, in the sense of practitioners, that we are also traumatized, right? And so when we start losing an affect to the video that Dr. Hardy showed, where you don't become emotional, understand that trauma has impacted you as well, as a provider. Because for me, one of the things that I'm invested in is that healing. And that healing is to get back to a place where when I see things like that, it does bring tears to my eyes. Because I remember the days where I could look at that and turn away from that, or walk over, blood splattered on the ground, and it didn't mean anything. So I ask myself, when we talk about that, we have to think about how we walk by trauma every day, right? So I see young men, I have an office that's right to the curb, and I see young men and young women walk by every day, and I have to stop every moment to say, wow, how can we rescue that person? Because I see trauma walking by every day. So we have to ask ourselves in that. But I want to just highlight three things in the sense of what's happening to our people. One is trauma really limits our ability to retain information, right? So it's like a child. You ever talk to your kid and you're saying, you need to do A, B, C, and D. And then they leave the room and they go back and they do the exact opposite. We don't realize that blockage is a sense of trauma that young person is experiencing, because they can't even retain what you're saying to them. This was me as a young child, right? It also, trauma also impacts folks in the sense of their ability to be receptive to new information. So we have to talk about how do we open up those channels again by having healing circles, right? So Dr. Hardy also talked about this thing where we think that we have to go to therapeutic environments in order to get healing. The true healing, and I can attest to this because we did this when we were incarcerated, it took 5 of us men with a commitment to healing that said that every week we would get in a room and talk about our pain. And that pain and that conversation without a doctor, without a therapist, led me to be a representative of them in this space today.
Very good.
So I just want to put that out there.
I'm getting this sign telling me that we're running out of time, but I want to ask the question for all three of you. President Clinton came from Hope, Arkansas. President Obama had his theory about, hope, how important that was. What does hope mean from your point of view in terms of how do we address this? Do you have this hope that now or in the next 10 years, the next century, are we going to resolve this issue of trauma in our community, or is it a permanent part of who we are? What's the hope that we can rest on? Anybody want to
How
answer
much
that?
time do we have to meditate on that?
Very little time. I'm about to get the sign
Be
saying
kind,
time's up,
come
right?
on.
I think part of the issue with hope is that we have to realize that we are worth continuing to try.
Good.
And I'm not sure how to maintain that every day, all day. But when you lose hope, you think you're not worth it. You think it's not worth it, that there's nothing that can be done. And I think it's an important component to know that we are worth it, that we are not inherently broken, that society and history has led us to this point, and we have a responsibility to help ourselves keep moving forward and to hold society accountable for their continuing role in keeping us where we are. Both things need to happen simultaneously, and my hope is that we are able to maintain that as we move forward.
We're going to get the next two comments. If you have a question, raise your hand, because I think the microphone can be taken to you if you're interested in responding. Oh, there's one right there. Okay, there's two. So I think there's three. Whoa. Okay, so the microphones will be brought to you. So hope, what's the reason to have hope when we're talking about the trauma, we're talking about all that we're suffering? What's the hope?
Yeah. Hope is freedom. I think without that, you are in chains and bondage to your past. And I say all the time, your past certainly formidably shapes and informs your present, but you don't want to be shackled to that. So the restoration of hope, or the establishment of hope, is really about freedom. But I certainly agree with everything that my distinguished colleagues have said here today, and that we do need to hold society accountable for those larger social determinants and the confluence of those things that are bearing down on us. But I would also say, in picking up on what Abergall said, that everything isn't about creating a new program or pursuing a grant. It's really about extending yourself. It's just about connection, extending your hand, having an open heart. And just the last thing I would say, just in terms of childhood trauma, someone mentioned something to me the other day that really resonated with me, is that we have generations of children that are growing up but not being raised. And there is a difference. And so I know it is very trendy to use the word resilience, and I mean no disrespect, but that word has always made me uncomfortable, because it seems to imply to me as if we are not impacted because we are so resilient. The truth is, as people, and in particularly as children, we're just time delayed. It's going to show up. So we can't just let our children grow up. We have to raise them.
Thank you.
Yeah, really, I'll be really brief. I think there's two things that's very important in giving our, specifically our youth, hope. I think we start with first a word that Obama used in his campaign, which is transparency.
Yeah.
I think as adults we're so afraid of transparency. To really let our kids understand that we made mistakes. Where we really came from. In this journey. So I think it starts with a level of transparency. The other word I think that's difficult is honesty. There's some people that would say, as Council Presley mentioned, not to talk about your past, not to talk about your abuse. There's some people would say, don't tell anybody that, so you can navigate that you did 10 years of a mandatory sentence. But that mandatory sentence, and where I sit here now, is hope for those young men who don't think that there's hope.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing that we're combating when we think about hope is imagery. There's a narrative being given about no hope and despair constantly through the news, the media, through rap music, about no hope and how you have to scramble. So the way that we change that is to change the images of what we project to our young men and our young women about what hope and what opportunity in the future can look like if they make good decisions.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. So we have a microphone walking somewhere. Okay. And if a person wants to have the microphone and
I mean, that we're speaking to it.
go ahead.
That's right.
Yeah.
Good morning. I just would like to say that as long as we have meetings like this and we have people like Dr. Kenneth Hardy and Councilwoman Ayanna Presley and Pamela and Charles Ogletree, there is still hope. And what we are doing is we are building a web of people that care about our people across this great Commonwealth of Massachusetts and across the country and across the world. And so there is hope. And we are change agents. And we are, each of us, making change because we are here today. And we will take what we were learning back to our communities and to our places of employment. And you can see black and white, young and old here today. And this is the hope that we have.
Thank you very much. Next question? Yep.
This
Stand
is
up.
to, this is to Councilor Presley. I'm wondering if you could share with us, if you wouldn't mind, how you overcame the trauma that you experienced.
I'm still overcoming. I see Tina Cherry here. We were together recently at the Massachusetts Office of Victims Assistance annual meeting or conference, and I was recalling how in 2011 a columnist asked if I felt finally successful because people had predicted that I would be a one-and-done city councilor for a host of reasons, and not only were we reelected, but because of people in this room, we topped the ticket. And he said, "Do you finally feel that you're successful?" And I said, "I won't feel I'm successful until I'm free." So, you know, for me, what I talk about is in no way abstract. It's intensely personal, and it's why I ran. So, you know, I would say my faith in God, certainly. My mother, you know, even in her own brokenness and trial and not having those interventions and supports to get her on a pathway to healing, she loved me so hard. You know, and that made a tremendous difference. But the last thing I would say is just in terms of violence, I really want to encourage us all to usher in a word revolution, again, where we don't have a tiering or we only name one violence. You know, all forms of violence are interrelated and connected. You know, how many gang-affiliated young men grew up in households where they saw their mother being abused at the hands of someone who said they loved them? You know, so domestic violence, sexual violence, youth and street violence. So if you're committed to peace, I'm asking you to just in that commitment and your strength of advocacy to begin with your language and to name sexual abuse and sexual assault and domestic violence because they're all interrelated and connected.
Thank you very much. Next question. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. How you doing? Thank you for being here. I just want to say one thing that I learned by working with a lot of young people in the past by coaching. What I learned that a lot of young people was told, because a young man came to me one time saying, "Only thing I'm hearing, learn how to forgive, but I don't know how to get rid of the anger." So when a lot of young people say, you know, okay, I can forgive, but we still wonder why this person is still angry because we're not asking them to go get help for the anger or go talk to someone. But also we have a lot of adults that come in young people's lives, talk to them, and then they be happy with them, and then they get connect, and then you have adults that walk away and they trying to figure out why why that person left from them. Thank you.
Yeah. So again, I mean, that's a touchy, you know, prior to my job at Madison Park Development Corporation, I worked at Youthful USA, and I went across the country just really managing different programs. And, you know, I always talk about, you know, one of the scary things for me is I always focused on the staff, you know, and I think we don't put enough weight on ourselves because more often I saw broken people trying to fix broken people, right? And so a woman stood up earlier and talked about the fact that we need to hold ourselves accountable. And I think that this doesn't mean that if we're a work in progress, we can't help others. But again, I go back to the word transparency. As I'm a work in progress, I have no problem with sharing them with a young man or a young woman that I am a work in progress. And while we go on this journey, we'll go together. And if I hit a landmine first, I'm going to share with you how to not to hit that landmine. But when I act like I've arrived in engaging them, and that I know more, and that I'm at this place that I'm really not, and some of us can't even bring them home to sit them at a table to have a good dinner. We have to ask ourselves, am I fit enough to really do the work? Because this is, the CDC I work for now, we talk about building, we do development, right? And one of the things I said to the executive director, I said, as a CEC, we don't only build buildings, we build people.
Thank you, brother. Right. Thank you.
And so when I hear you talk about this with young men, the key is that we have to understand that one of the core elements of young people, going back to what Council Presley said, is emotional abandonment. And if we can't bridge the gap of that emotional abandonment, then we should leave them alone. Honestly, because in most senses, we'll do more damage than we'll do good.
That's right. That's right.
Great, thank you.
I'm next, Sarah.
question in the
I'm
back?
next. I'm next. Sarah.
Go
I'm
ahead.
next.
I'm next. Okay.
To the back and then come back to Sarah.
I've been standing here patiently.
They're sisters. The sisters are dueling.
Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be here. One thing I just want to say about hope is that we have to show love to our children, whether they're children that we bore, whether they're children that are out in the street, but we have to wrap our arms around them and show them love and show them that we do care about them. That is another way of giving them hope.
Thank
I
you very
agree.
much.
Can I say something about that, Professor?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So just picking up on what Abigail was saying, the reason why I believe so many of our young people are sitting in that self-loathing and cannot receive that love which you might try to extend is because of a lack of honesty and transparency. Well, they seem all together and well-adjusted, so why would they ever love me? And the media doesn't help because we do, again, create this tiering of what children we value and who we celebrate and who we don't. So I completely agree with that. Thank you, Priscilla, for making that point.
Great, all right. Sarah, go ahead. You got the microphone.
Hi. Thank you all for your presentations. My name is Sarah Flint, and I'm a mother of a homicide victim, and the trauma is a real crucial issue, and I'm glad that it's finally coming to the forefront. My question is, as far as the school systems, like Albert, you said that you know how they shut down the Columbine and different colleges, high schools and colleges when there's a violence. But our schools do not do that. Our inner city schools, because I remember the incident that happened on Warren Street in Walgreens. They have a high school right across the street, and nobody shut it down. It wasn't shut down. The kids actually walked out from school and saw 2 bodies laying in the street. And dealing with the education piece, there's nothing in place in our schools. What is being addressed about that? For the trauma, because these young kids are being traumatized, going to school, and the teachers are not really sensitive to the issues, and what is being addressed as far as getting the schools and the teachers more, more educated about how to deal with our kids, because it's with them coming in school, being traumatized, first thing they do is call the police. Then you have the kids going and the police come, then they wind up with quarries. So what is my question? What is being done to look at this issue and do something about it?
Good question. Anybody want to respond?
Really quickly. I can't speak to what is really being done, but I can say this, right? And we're seeing this with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I say this to the practitioners here. Our youth are not waiting on you. Right. They're tired of waiting. Right? And so what you see when you see, like this morning I was driving here and I saw where there was an incident and the young people put how they put the candles and they create that memorial out there, right? And that's a sign of our kids saying, we can't wait on you. We can't even trust you anymore. Right? So the question becomes, how do we stop? Because I believe in the systems change. But I'll say this as a young person who was in that space. If I waited on the system to change, to create opportunity for me, I still wouldn't be here right now. There were some things about my life and the people that I surrounded myself that I had to take back. And so when we talk about this situation with trauma in the schools, we have to ask ourselves, how do we create a system along with the system that allows us to honor the pain that we're talking about right now and just take action? Because if we don't, our kids are going to get ahead of us, right? And one last point. The saddest thing that I experienced with the first incident of Ferguson was they had a meeting at the church on Warren Street around the Ferguson issue, right? So here's how divided we are. There was a meeting with all of the elected officials and all these folks at the 12th Baptist Church, right? Then right down the street, there were young people. This is my sister. She wasn't there, though. But right down the street, right, I want to show you how disconnected we are really quickly. Right down the street, we had thousands of young folks.
That's right.
In a march by themselves with no leadership while all of the intellectuals were meeting in the church. Mm-hmm. Now tell me that makes sense. So that for me hurt my heart because it shows that when we start talking about what the problem really is with these issues we're having, whether it be race, whether it be trauma, is that how do we come together in the same space, right, and mandate some of our young people to be in rooms like this to hear that we love them.
Thank you.
Oh, wait, Courtney?
I just have to add quickly, because part of what I'm saying is that we need to love each other and hug each other and shield each other, but meanwhile the world is still beating us on the back. So do we just only keep our heads turned in, or do we turn out collectively? And I think that's what these youth are doing. They're not just holding each other's hands. They are trying to hold the system accountable while also caring for each other. So the point I'm making is that it has to happen simultaneously. Right. We can't just hug each other and love each other and hope for it to go away. We have to do both at the same time.
Well, can I just say, I can tell you what's happening in our schools and what needs to happen because I need your help. Okay, so the first thing is, I very much appreciate our wanting to prepare our children for workforce and life and the emphasis on rigor, but you cannot say you want to teach a whole child if you're not honest that most of them are entering the doors broken.
That's right.
So what is the commitment and the investment you're willing to make to get them whole? Because you know what? You cannot learn if you're hungry. You cannot learn if you're sitting in trauma. And so we need an investment in social emotional wellness supports, more school nurses, more school-based health centers, more health resource centers. We will continue to have an achievement gap. We will continue to have dropouts until we address trauma. And the last thing I would say that supports that as well is a teaching force that reflects the diversity of this city. And not just race, gender. We have a male teacher shortage crisis, and I am certain it is contributing to what we see with our black and brown boys.
We're running out of time. I know there are hands up.